Today's topic is all about RackFX on Allen and Heath digital consoles. And I'm not really going to be going into kind of the specifics of like what reverb is, what delay is, and chorus and so on. I think there's so many resources online already that could tell you all about that stuff, and you could endlessly scroll through blogs and get very detailed explanations. This is more as it pertains to our digital consoles, how to use the RackFX, what they are, and kind of the different options that you have, because you might already be using RackFX, but you might not be using all of the different settings that are available to you. So by the end of this, you'll have more flexibility, hopefully in how you're using them, and you can maybe make use of some effects that you weren't using before because of effects buses, and you'll learn all about that today. So let's just dive right in. First of all, I'm just going back to analog days for now. We're going back in time. The reason I'm showing this is because a lot of the terminology we use and a lot of the concepts we're going to talk about, they're all rooted back in analog consoles when all the gear was outboard and we had to have ways of connecting in our reverb effect or our compressor that wasn't built into the console. So if you're old enough to remember those days when most things were analog, then you might be familiar with this. But just in case, because I know there's all kinds of people from different backgrounds here, there are two main ways to connect outboard gear to an analog console. The first one is in the top left here. It's called an insert patch, and basically this is when you want an effect to be kind of in line on a channel. You would use an insert cable where it's TRS on one side, and then you have two TS in a Y cable on the other side, and you'd connect it to the insert point on the channel if your mixer supports that. And then one side would go to the input of the effects processor. It would go through the processor and do whatever processing you need. Then the output would come back in and come back into the mixer on the same cable and then run through the rest of the channel strip. So that's usually used for like compressors and EQs and gates and external effects that are more dynamic. And then there's, of course, the send and return effect. So this is more used for like time-based effects like reverbs and delays. And the way this would be patched in is you would go from normally a post-fader aux. The reason you use post-fader is because if you bring down the actual channel that you're applying reverb to, you also want the reverb to go away. So by using a post-fader aux, bringing down the channel fader also brings down the reverb of that channel. So you would go out from a post-fader aux output to the input of your effects processor, and then the output of your effects processor would come back into the mixer, usually on a stereo channel, could be a mono channel if you want, and this is called the effects return channel. And then you can kind of bring this up to bring up kind of the wet signal of all of the channels that you're sending, because you could use this aux3 send to send as many channels as you want to this effects processor and have them all be processed, and then the wet signals all together on this return channel. So just keep that in mind, because these are also the two ways that you can use our built-in effects on our digital consoles. So let's just look more in depth on each of those. So send and return is what we're going to start with. So with a send and return, as it says, an FX processor is fed by a bus on your console, and then the output of the effects processor comes back in on a return channel. And the main benefit of this is that multiple channels can make use of the same effect. So if you have a 64-channel Avantis or 128-channel D-Live, you can send all of those input channels to the same bus, and then that all that bus combines all of those inputs and feeds the effects processor. So you're really making the best use of an effects processor. So if you don't have a lot of effects processing, but you have a lot of channels to apply it to, then this is really the best way to do it, because you're busing them together and using multiple channels on the same effect. And then, of course, when you have that return channel, you can do a nice mix between the dry signal from the original channel sent to the mains and the effects return channel sent to the mains. And so you get a good balance between the wet signal and the dry signal. The return channel, of course, we saw on the analog mixer, it's just an input channel. That's where the effects is coming back in. On our digital consoles, we have those return channels are kind of, they're not included in the count of the input channels, but they are basically input channels. Like a D-Live would have 128 input channels to work with, plus your return channels. So there are really more input channels on a D-Live than 128, but they're dedicated as effects return channels. you can use a dedicated effects bus for this, or you can use a generic bus. So you'll learn more about that later on in this presentation, but all of our consoles have dedicated effects buses that are kind of meant specifically for this purpose, but you can also use just a standard aux or a group or your mains if you wanted to feed an effects processor if you wanted to. And this is normally used, like I said, for time-based effects like reverbs and delays and chorus, but I'll emphasize that it's normally, because there might be some of you that prefer to use those types of effects as inserts, and that's totally fine. It's whatever the result is that really matters. And so if you take a look at the diagram on the right side, this is just kind of showing how the signal flow works. The input, any number of inputs can feed this effects bus. Then that effects bus feeds the effects processor. That's like the actual effects rack. And then the output of that effects rack comes back in on a return channel, which is really the same as an input. And then you could blend the dry signal directly from the input to the mains, and the effects return channel can also go to the mains, and this is the wet signal. So you have the dry signal without effects and the wet signal with effects, both going to the main mix. And a question that I often received when I was in tech support was, how do I get my reverbs to be heard in aux mixes for my monitors on stage? My vocalist wants to hear reverb because they like the way it sounds. Well, you have to send the effects return channel to the aux. You might already know how to send the input channel to the aux, but you have to remember to send the effects return. These on all of our consoles are by default already being routed to the main mix so that you could hear your effects, but they're not by default all routed to your auxiliary mixes. And that's why it became a challenge for some people. So you have to remember that if you want to hear reverb in your monitor mixes, you have to turn up your FX returns in your monitor mixes. Make sure that those are sent as well to get the wet signal in your monitors. All right, everyone cool with that? So now option number 2 is an insert. So this is when you have an effects processor inserted in line on a channel, and that's like what we looked at with that TRS Y cable. And so it's usually limited to one channel per effects processor. There's dual mono on DLive and I think Avantis as well. So we'll learn more about that later. But in general, it's that's kind of the problem with inserts sometimes, is that you're using up an entire effects rack for a single channel. And sometimes that's the right thing to do, but sometimes if you're limited in the total amount of effects racks you have, then it's not really great because you're sacrificing an entire effects rack for a specific channel. You can also insert it on a bus. So if you have like an entire drum group, you can insert an effects rack on that drum group, and there's probably times to do that. And it's normally used for dynamic effects like compressors and gates and EQs. But like I said, if you want to use a compressor as kind of a send and return, that's totally fine. If you want to use a reverb as an insert, it's totally fine. It's more the end result that matters. And so here's what it looks like. You have an input running through the effects rack, and then this is the wet signal in green, and that's feeding the main mix and the aux, and you don't really have the dry signal, but you'll see that there is a way around that with our mixers where you can add some of the dry signal back, and I'll show you how to do that. So here's just an overview of kind of the capabilities of all our different console series in terms of effects racks. So Q and SQ, you'll see both have one insert point per channel. And DLive and Avantis actually have an insert A and an insert B on every single input channel. So that's kind of cool. You can have multiple effects inserted. You can also use external hardware with your inserts. And you can use kind of like Waves plugins, things like that. Basically, you can either use the internal effects, or you can send it, have an output socket be your send and an input socket be your return. So you could basically use anything as an insert on your channels. In terms of dedicated effects buses, so these are effects buses that are specifically meant for effects sends. And so on Q, depending on which model you have, you can have between 2 and 4. So a Q16, that's what this image is showing here. This is kind of the master section of a Q16. You have FX1 and FX2 dedicated buses, but you actually have 4 FX racks on a Q16. So this is across all Q models. So in order to make use of effects racks 3 and 4 on a Q16, you can either use them as inserts, or you can sacrifice one of your auxes, like mix 1, you can have be your third effects send if you want. And I'll show you how to do that soon. So that there are ways of making use of those additional effects racks, even though you might not have dedicated buses for them. SQ, same concept. You have 4 dedicated effects buses, but you have 8 effects racks. but keep in mind that certain add-ons for SQ, are like dynamic EQ and multiband compressor, the way those are used on SQ is as effects racks. So for effects racks, 5 to 8, you might want to use those as inserts on channels because they're dynamic effects. You might want to sacrifice some of your auxes on SQ to feed your additional effects racks that don't have dedicated buses for them. So for Avantis and DLive, it's very similar. You have 2 insert points per channel. I rate flex here because on Avantis and DLive, the way the buses work is that they're not specific, like you have this many auxes, this many groups, this many effects buses. You just have a total amount of buses to work with, and you can allocate those as you need. So it really depends on how your bus configuration is set up and how many you have allocated specifically to effects buses. So with Avantis, you have 42 total buses. With DLive, you have 64 total buses, and you can have as many of those be effects buses as you want. But of course, it would be kind of silly to exceed the total amount of effects racks you have. But you have a lot to work with on Avantis. You have 12 effects racks, and DLive as well. You have 16 effects racks to work with. And we're going to go more in depth on all the settings for those effects racks shortly. So here we go. Here is what the RackFX screen looks like on DLive. It's very similar for all of our other consoles. So if you're looking at a Q or an SQ or an Avantis, it's going to look very similar to this. So here at the top, this is where you'd select which effects rack you're modifying. So you can see this is a DLive. So these are the first 8, but I could scroll over and there would be another 8 because there's 16 total effects racks. Here's the global tap tempo. So you have a global tap tempo that would apply to all effects. But when you have one, like this is an effect like a tap delay that actually has a tap tempo integrated into it. So you could choose to use this one that's specific to this effects rack, or you can use the global one. So that would have all of your effects in sync with each other versus a local one that's specific to this particular rack. Over here at the bottom, so this is your the master for the effect send. So in this case, because this effect rack is configured as a mix return, what you're looking at here is the master for the bus. So when you look at the actual fader strips, this is what it looks like, but this is the same as this. So this is called your effect send, and this is what would actually show up on your console fader strips, and that's exactly this here. So you also have access to the fader strip within the effects rack screen if you'd like to make adjustments like adjust the fader, see the levels, mute it or pathful it. And same with the effects return. This is what it looks like on your actual fader strips, but you also have access to the controls right here within the effects rack screen for the effects return if you wanted to mute it or pathful it or adjust the levels. Here is what the, so at the top here, this is where you'd access like the back panel of the effect. So right now we're looking at the front panel, but we can access the back panel, and that's where we make kind of changes to the actual like patching for the effect. So if we want to change it into an insert versus a mix return, that's where we're going to do it, is on the back panel. So this is what it looks like. And this is a screen that you might not have looked at before. If you don't really dive into effects racks, you might just use them as sends and returns and not really go into the back panel very much. But this can be pretty useful if you wanted to make changes to how the effect is used. So this, when you're on the back panel, you'll see this drop down in the top left. This is where you determine whether this effect is a mix return or if it's an insert on a particular channel. And so right now it's configured as a mix return. Patch from. So remember I said that you don't necessarily have to use a dedicated effects bus to feed an effects rack. You could use anything. So if I open this dropdown, I can now switch between the dedicated FX1 bus, because we're on FX rack 1, so it'd be FX1 bus. But I could also feed it from a group or an aux or a mains or basically anything that I choose. So that can be useful in certain circumstances. If your effects racks exceed your amount of effects buses, then you might want to do something like that. There's all kinds of flexibility in your routing. View outputs, this is just to see everywhere the output of this effects rack is feeding. In this case, it's just going to be feeding the return channel, the stereo return. So that's basically how you'd see if you hit view outputs. And so this is basically the simplest way of looking at the back panel. But if we change it to instead be an insert, we have some additional options here. So right now you can see we changed the selection to insert. So now this drop down here, instead of determining which bus feeds it, we're now saying, where do we want it inserted? Because this is a DLive that we're looking at, there's input insert A or insert B because there's 2 insert points on each channel. So if I selected insert A, then I have this little widget here to choose which channel I want it inserted on as insert A. If I selected insert B, it'd be the same thing. I could choose which channel exactly I want it inserted on in the insert B position. I can also have it inserted on any kind of bus that I want within my console. And here's a little feature that you might not have known about, but this is what I was alluding to earlier. When you have it set as an insert, you can also use this to control the dry-wet balance of the output of the effects rack. So that's kind of cool because normally when you insert like a reverb on an input channel, the end result is just completely drowned in reverb, but now I can include some of the dry signal as well, along with the wet signal. And I can also monitor the level of the insert return. And keep in mind that when you're doing inserts, you can also do it from the actual channel level. So this is on the processing screen. I have a particular channel selected, and I selected insert A at the top as because you can kind of scroll through the different levels of processing. And you can also here, if you select RackFX, then you'll have an option of choosing which effects rack we want to use as an insert on this particular channel. So it's just to show that you can either set up the insert from the back panel of the effects rack, or you can do it on the channel itself. Sorry, just reading the chat here. Yeah, I agree, Nathan. That's a great idea. I will pass that on. Nathan's suggesting that we should have like a select option for when we look at the effects return and the effects send. So now we're just going to look at libraries. If you've seen my my masterclass on libraries, then you're probably already familiar with all this. But just to be sure, when you actually want to change which effect is loaded up in each rack, you'd first select the rack in question, and then open the library. And you'll see 2 columns here. And so the first column is to choose the type of effect. And then the second column here is to choose a particular preset, which is kind of just a starting point for your effect. So if you wanted to change which type of effect is loaded up, you just select it from this menu, select a particular preset. But of course, you don't have to stick with whatever the preset is. You can modify it and you could store it. And then you'd hit recall, and that would bring up the other type of effect. And keep in mind that there are 2 types of libraries. There are factory libraries, and those are factory presets that Alan and Heath has designed and already loaded up onto your console for your convenience. Or if you have a particular blend of reverb that you like that you want to save for later use, then you could store your user presets as well, and those will show up in green on the appropriate menu that goes with the type of effect that you were using. Dan, you had a question? Dan raised his hand, might have been by accident. Oh, and Dan is gone. Okay, so he just wanted to leave. He had to use the bathroom. Okay, but yeah, that's basically, that concludes our deep dive into, okay, no problem, Dan. Any questions about anything that we went over today? I'll be glad to go over it, or if there's anything non-related to effect, I'm glad to answer any questions you guys have. Just pop it in the chat or unmute yourself.
I do have a question about effects on monitors for the QUSB, which probably be similar to 16, but keeping in mind that the QUSB is all, iPad controlled. I normally use my SQ. 95% of the time I use my SQ. I love it. However, there are times when I have like a small gig in a restaurant and he won't let me set up my mixer. So I just want to set up the QUSB and sit at a table with my iPad and run the show. The only thing I haven't figured out yet is how to get effects into the monitors for those rare singers that want reverb in their monitors. I mean, like, to me, it's crazy. But anyway, that's what they want. And is there I cannot see how to do it. I just
So-
can't see how to do it.
That goes back to this slide that we looked at earlier. So I assume you're using your effects as send returns. So remember that when you send an input to the effects bus, it goes through the effects processor, and then it comes back in as the effects return. And by default, like I said, these are already being sent to the main mix. That's why you can already hear reverb in your main mix as soon as you send it. But you won't hear it in an aux unless you send the effects return channel to your aux. So that's basically, I think, what's missing is that you have to look at the mix that's being fed to that vocalist's monitor and make sure that the effects return is being fed to that aux. In fact, you could just send all the effects returns to that aux probably, and I don't think you'd have any issues. So make sure that that's being sent, because that's going to be where the wet signal is.
Okay, I just didn't see that on the app where I could adjust that. That's all. Is what really what I
Okay,
was-
well, yeah, basically just look for the effects return faders. It's been a while since I've been into that app, but you might just go through the left-hand side, like between the different layers, look for the effects returns, and then make sure you have the mix selected that corresponds with their aux mix, and then turn up the effects returns to that aux, and then they should start hearing the reverb there.
Okay, I'll play with it. Thanks.
Okay, no problem. You're looking for recordings of masterclasses. That I'm working on it. I promise we're going to have a nice archive that you guys can look through, because there's lots of great stuff there. We don't want people to forget about it. Routing one effect into another. Yeah, you can absolutely do that. So like I said, the effects return channels behave just like input channels. So if you wanted to route one effect into another, what I would do is send the input to the effects bus that corresponds with my reverb, for example, and then this effects return you could send into another effects bus that feeds a delay. That would totally work. It's kind of you have to be careful not to get lost in that. Like for example, if you send the effects return for this effects processor into this bus, that creates a feedback loop. So just be careful when sending effects returns into effects sends. Make sure that's a different send from the one that corresponds with that return. But you could totally do that because this behaves just like an input channel. Let's see. Omar, if you want to learn more about that expert section, like I said, I'm not going to dive too much into like the actual settings on the racks, but within the reference guide for DLive is probably the best way. It'll explain every single little function there, and we can maybe do another in-depth one specifically on that stuff. Custom rotaries for different uses for different users. Woody, in that case, I would probably set up a user scene to recall when those users log in, and that scene changes the custom rotaries and anything else you want to change for that user. So most of our consoles have that, where each on the user screen, you select the user and there's a particular scene that recalls when they log in. And so that could bring up a different state of the console, and that might choose what is assigned to the custom rotaries. Let's see. Any way to send effects to MEs? Great question. Great question. Yeah, so like I said, the effects return channels, those behave like inputs. So you could send the direct outs of those effects returns to your MEs, to one of your 40 ME channels. Or what you can also do is create a group of all your effects returns and send that group as an ME channel. That's a great question. Anyone else have any questions about effects racks or anything else, Alan and Heath? Cool. Well, I'll stick around for a little bit. Thank you all for joining, and thank you to those of you who filled out the survey. We got